This week we're going to get into the second part of the book of Numbers. In it, we're making a transition from the first generation that dies in the wilderness, that generation that came out of Egypt and saw the plagues and the parting of the sea. They're all going to die in the wilderness because they didn't have the faith to let God lead them into the land. And we're transitioning to the second generation who is going to experience the promised land, the return to that covenant land. We find that even Moses is stretched to his limits. When God tells him that he should just speak to the rock and water will come forth, instead he strikes it. And God tells him that because of that, he won't be able to enter the land. That might seem harsh to us, but you can see what God says in chapter 20, verse 12. Because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the people, you will not enter the land. God cares about holiness in his people, in his leaders. Also here in Numbers, we learn about Balaam. Balaam is the means that God uses to give promises to this next generation as they're ready to enter the land. And so as we finish up the book of Numbers this week, we're going to see this transition as we're ready to move to the next step of God's plans and purposes for his people. And so that takes us into the book of Deuteronomy. It's another difficult book to read. The structure of Deuteronomy is set up like a vassal treaty, a treaty between two political parties. And so God uses a recognizable form as he sets up this formal agreement with his people. It's also used for land grants, and God is ready to grant Israel the land. Remember, the land is God's. He allows Israel to be tenants in it. The book of Deuteronomy is also made up of 3 separate addresses by Moses. We could call them sermons, as he prepares the people to enter the land. This is his swan song. He's ready to leave them, put them in the capable hands of Joshua as they move into the land. And so Deuteronomy makes up these last speeches. The purpose of the book is to formalize the covenant that was made at Sinai, to recommit to it. It's the second generation that's signing up to enter as God's people into the land that he has given to them. We find an important theme of God's name. God's name is going to be put in the land, in the place of his dwelling. And remember, all the way back when the Babel builders, the tower builders, tried to get God's presence back among them, it was a failure because they did not honor God's name. They wanted to honor their own name. But now God is going to make a place for his name. And so in Deuteronomy, Moses revisits the details of the law. He tells them it's not difficult. Funny, when we read the law, we think it's difficult. But in the Old Testament, they never looked at the law as a burden. They looked at it as a blessing, an act of grace. We often put law and grace on opposite ends of a spectrum. But for Israel, the law was grace, God's grace in communicating to them. So it's not difficult. Moses says, I set before you today life and prosperity or death and destruction. Your call. Tip, choose life. Be God's people. And that's what he's calling them to in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, of course, in the Deuteronomy segments, then, we have a restatement of what we call the 10 Commandments. They were introduced at Sinai in Exodus 20, and God goes through them again here in Deuteronomy 5 through Moses. We call them the 10 Commandments. It's kind of interesting because that's not what the Bible calls them. The Bible calls them the 10 words. Some have preferred the 10 principles, ideas, because they're more than just a blunt statement. Jesus makes this clear to us in the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard it said, don't murder. But I tell you, there's a whole lot more to it. And so it is with the 10 words, the 10 principles. There's a lot more to it. And Deuteronomy helps unpack some of that additional content. Let's just take a couple as examples. In saying to, they're not supposed to use idols. That doesn't have to do with a certain kind of artwork. It doesn't have to do with whether they actually showed a picture of a person or an animal. It doesn't have to do with whether you have a picture of Jesus over your bed. The idea of using images comes out of the ancient world, where they believed images were the means by which God mediated his presence. The essence of the God was in those images, and that's how the God was worshipped, through the images. And so this second word is all about this mediatorial role. And God says that's not how it works. That's not how he works in the world. And that we shouldn't think in terms of approaching him through some mediator instrumentation like that, an image created by the hands of craftsmen. We get to saying 3, not to take the Lord's name in vain. Traditionally, we've thought of that as maybe false oaths or even profanity. But those are both actions which act as if the name of God is powerless. You use it casually. You use it without sincerity. You treat it as powerless. The saying is really more directed toward those who recognize the full power of the name of God, and they want to use it for their own purposes and agendas. And so in that sense, like magic used in the ancient world, using the name of a god to accomplish a particular end. And God says, my name should not be used for your empty purposes. It should be treated with respect as something that has power. There is power in the name of God. And that power is not vested in the name itself, but the name represents the person. The more powerful the person, the more powerful the name. God is warning the Israelites against what we call identity theft. If someone steals your social security number, your credit card number, they can use your power, your economic power, your identity for their own worthless purposes. And so God doesn't want his name used as a means of power. He has trusted us with his name, and he wants it to be used properly. We get to saying 4, the Sabbath. As Christians, we don't know what to do with the Sabbath. I guess I'm supposed to rest. The Sabbath is connected to God's rest among his people. God's rest is not his leisure or his relaxation. God's rest is taking up his residence in an ordered world. He ordered the world in order to rule it. And he takes up his residence, his rest, on his throne to rule. And when we observe Sabbath, we are not imitating God. We are participating with God. We are joining his plans and purposes. We're setting aside the things we normally do during the week to order our own world, to say that God's the one who orders our world. God's the one who is on the throne. And so we participate with him as we make it a kingdom day, God's day, where we don't pursue our own order, but pursue his. So the major themes that we find in the book of Deuteronomy, of course, we find the idea of covenant in Torah, recommitted to that relationship, Israel and God. It's God's revelation of himself, because as he reveals what constitutes holy living, he reveals himself. He shows us that he is still working to carry out his plans and purposes through Israel, despite the fact that they've been faithless from the top all the way down. But God's going to work despite them if he has to, through them as they will, as he carries out his plans and purposes. We learn about the importance of the central sanctuary. There's going to be one place in the land, and God will dwell there, in his land, among his people. We learn about history as theology, that as God has been unfolding all of this, it's toward a purpose. God has purposes, and he gives us the privilege of being partners with him. Israel was God's instrument, God's people, God's partners. We are his instrument, his people, and his partners in carrying out his purposes. That's what he made us for. It's what he saved us for. It's what we're elected to. And it's what our faith is all about. Partnering with God as he works out his kingdom. Your kingdom come. Your will be done.